He made it.
All right. Hello, Hartmut. This is Chris Thompson. I'm going to be hosting your session. Let me change my name. Celia, thanks for coming in, but I actually made it somehow.
I was concerned.
As
No,
well, you should be. I'm concerned about myself on a regular basis. All right. So thank you, Celia. And hello, Hartmut. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Love your shirt. So I'm going to moderate and introduce you and moderate the session. Do you want questions to show up in the chat and we'll get to the questions at the end of the session? How would you like to run it?
Yeah, considering that we are limited to, I think 75 minutes, I think to make it run the smoothest, we probably mute everybody, have them please introduce themselves as they feel comfortable.
Okay.
On the chat section and enter their questions as they come up during the presentation into the chat or comment section. And then I'm hoping that I'll be done at about 65 minute mark and get some time for Q&A at the end.
Great, fantastic. I'll just keep an eye on the chat and try to get a list of any questions as they accumulate and make sure we get to those at the point that you wrap up your presentation. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes or so. I am going to pause the recording for a moment. Okay, welcome everybody to this afternoon session of the second day of the Functional Aging Summit, Virtual 2021. I'm Dr. Chris Thompson here hosting our presenter. This is Hartmut Broring. Let me tell you a little bit about Hartmut. He was trained in Germany and got his physiotherapy degree back in 1995. He's been working extensively with the 65 and over population essentially since then. And he really enjoys the opportunity to bring them better health and well-being, while also considering some of the chronic conditions and frailty issues they're dealing with. So Hartmut today is going to be presenting on defeating frailty every day, a team approach. Thanks for coming on today, Hartmut, and you may take it away.
Thank you, Christian, for that intro. Yeah, let me just fill in a bit of the history. As Christian said, I graduated in '95 with a degree in physiotherapy from the University of Cologne. I had already started in the beginning of the '90s to work with the city of Cologne and their senior center's adaptive physical ed outreach program. Came then to the US in '95, summer of '95, started working for a physical therapy clinic here in San Jose. And then started in '96 back in Form. And the reason I'm talking about frailty is because that has been the population we have been most consistently working with since 1996. In order to keep today's lecture moving, I have had Chris mute all the attendants. I ask you kindly to use the chat option and comment options to ask questions, leave me questions, or introduce yourself as much as you feel comfortable. And then we will address your questions and comments at the end. Hopefully we have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of this meeting. Again, thank you very much for attending today's meeting. Let's get rolling. If you have been attending in the past FAI lectures, you've been going through their work material, or you have had the we're fortunate enough to witness a Cody Sipe lecture in one of the IDEA events, you definitely have come across the FAI hierarchy of functional aging. I chose this slide to begin today because I think makes a good starting point to clarify this very wide spectrum of fitness and physical abilities and who it is within that hierarchy that we are talking about in today's lecture. Just like fitness comes in many variations amongst younger folks, the same holds true for the 60+ population. We have top athletes in their 90s that are still competing in marathon runs, etc. And we have people that are in their 70s carrying around oxygen bottles and have become frail or even dependent. Today's lecture is about the last three groups in this hierarchy model. We're talking about the pre-frail, the frail, and the dependent. Those are going to be the subject of today's talk. My goal today is to give you insights into the definition of frailty, understand the complexity of the syndrome, and understand why we need a multidisciplinary approach in order to be successful. At the final part, then I'm going into team expansion. And by team expansion, I will be talking about our team expansion. And by our team, I mean, because of the audience, I'm talking about those of us who are actively involved in dealing with the physical aspects, physical fitness aspects of frailty. Okay. Number one, defining frailty. I have 3 parts, 3 objectives in this lecture. Number one, we define frailty. And I think in order to understand, we need to understand frailty. We need to have a common ground to work from when trying to prevent or reverse frailty. We need to know what is frailty and who is considered frail. And bit of a spoiler alert, as of today, there really still is not a gold standard for a definition of frailty syndrome. However, there have been many attempts and models to qualify and quantify frailty. And I will today introduce you to 2 of the most commonly used models that are used in the field to diagnose frailty. Number 2, strategies to prevent and reverse frailty. In this part, I will introduce some of the most commonly used and successful strategies to prevent and reverse frailty. This chapter will also shed some light on the need for a multidisciplinary approach in the prevention of and treatment of frailty, and give you some insights into who the team members should be. And then finally, in the final part, I will make the case for a team approach beyond the part that is already covered in lecture 2. In the second part, I will specifically get into the expansion of, like I said, our team, the physical fitness team, dealing with the growing problem of frailty and the growing need for care. Good. Without further ado, let's get started with the definition. Now, I believe when I mentioned the word frailty, that we all have some kind of a visual. My own is an older woman or an older man, fragile looking, bent over, holding on to a cane or walker, moving very slowly. I'm sure we all share similar visuals on this. I want to start the definition by starting out real simple and look at what how Merriam-Webster is defining frail and frailty. The Merriam-Webster defines frail as being physically weak. I think we all agree that's kind of what we expected. And accordingly, the frailty is the quality or the state of being frail. This is a very one-sided or simple definition of frailty. However, frailty today has become a syndrome, or is understood as a medical syndrome and a diagnosis. And that goes well beyond the definition of Merriam-Webster's definition of frailty. The one I'm introducing here right now is the definition by Xian Li Shu. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins. And he defines frailty as a syndrome that is commonly found in older adults, and it increases the risk for poor health outcomes. That includes falls, hospitalization, disability, and mortality. Clearly, this definition focuses on the physical aspects of frailty, and the greater vulnerability to stressors is mostly due to declining physiological systems, including your metabolism, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, muscle strength, sarcopenia, bone density loss, etc. Good, moving on. All right, now, since 2001, there have been many attempts to define and quantify frailty. The very first one in 2001 was the model called the Frailty Criteria, and it was developed by Linda Fried and others at Johns Hopkins. This model that she developed is a phenotypical model to assess frailty. And by phenotypical models, these are models, observable characteristics in the individuals that develop when genotypes interact with their environment. She came up with five different phenotypes, which she considered important or red flags when it comes to compromised energetics and a heightened vulnerability and poor health outcomes. These phenotypes were then further defined in two separate studies. There was the cardiovascular health study, and there was the women's health and aging study. The first phenotype that they identified was low grip strength. Low grip strength was measured with a hand dynamometer. You all know probably this contraption, it's two metal things that you kind of try to push together, and you have a little scale at the top that shows how much pressure you're applying to the dynamometer. Low grip strength was separated in two groups, A, by gender, women and men. Men naturally a little stronger typically, but it was also further defined by BMI, recognizing that those who are more heavy set are typically have a little higher grip strength than those who are very slight build. So for women, the group or the grip strength was defined as lower than 17 to 21 kilograms. And that was based on BMIs of below 23 at the low end and above 29 at the high end. For men, the low grip strength was defined as less than 29 to 32 kilograms of pressure, and BMIs that correspond with below 24 and above 28. So that was the first phenotype. What is the second? The second is low energy. Well, low energy was measured or not measured. It was basically an interview point where the subject is self-reporting on his or her level of energy. Both studies asked a slightly different question. In the first study, it was asked whether the person had difficulties performing activities of daily living, and that led to premature exhaustion in the week up to the interview. And the other study asked whether the person was extremely tired and weak over the past months prior to the interview. Self-reported, second phenotype, low energy. Number 3, slow walking speed. And that was defined equally for men and women as needing more than 6 seconds to complete 15 feet, to walk 15 feet. So that's a pretty objective measurement, and was the way they determined slow walking speed. Low physical activity. This was, well, it was interview based, and what they used in this interview is the 18-item Minnesota Leisure Activity Questionnaire, and they defined low physical activity as scoring in the lowest 20% of energy expenditure of physical activity per day and by gender. What that meant that women who were spending less than 270 kilocalories per day and men who spend less than 383 kilocalories per day were considered as people that are engaging only in low physical activity. Number 5, the last phenotype, was defined as unintentional weight loss. And this is defined in a couple of different ways. over the period of a year, unintentional weight loss of 10 pounds or greater, or 5% of body weight or greater. In the Women's Health and Aging study, it was further defined as dropping in the BMI under 18.5. So now that we have these 5 phenotypes, Linda Fried decided that if you were presenting with 3 or more of these phenotypes, you were considered frail. If it was 1 or 2, you were considered pre-frail. And only if you had absence of all of these phenotypes, you were considered robust. That is a pretty broad definition. It's not very detailed. And that's quite possibly the reason why Rockwood and others in 2005 came up with the clinical frailty scale. The clinical frailty scale was a more detailed investigation that Rockwood was hoping would result in a better predictability of needed care and assistance for the frail elder. The clinical frailty scale was part of the introduction of the second clinical examination in Canadian Study of Health and Aging, just to mention it, don't have to remember that. And it was meant to summarize the overall levels of fitness and or frailty in an older adult. And the evaluation was done by experienced clinicians. Now, at the end of this evaluation, the frailty scale assigned the test individuals to one of 9 fitness or frailty levels. And I have the picture here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you to see it, because I think this is otherwise a little hard to read. That covers about most of it. So 9 fitness and frailty levels, reaching all the way from fit to terminally ill. Just last year, the clinical frailty scale was revised, and there were some minor changes to it. Today, we no longer talk about well in the second category, and instead talk about fit. This was very fit, number 1. Number 2 is now fit. Number 4 changed from vulnerable to living with very mild frailty. And 5, 6, 7, 8 were restated as living with mild, moderate, severe, and very severe frailty, respectively. Terminally ill stayed as is. What Rockwood also integrated, which we did not see with Linda Fried, was cognitive impairment, dementia in older adults. And what they found was a strong correspondence between mild dementia with mild forms of frailty, moderate with moderate, and severe with severe forms of frailty. Good. Moving on. Both the phenotype and the frailty scale are very much focused on biological changes associated with aging. The frailty cycle that you can see here is trying to better describe the various interactions of those biological changes. The authors, which is Linda Fried and others, are hypothesizing that this onset of frailty can be initiated by any of the clinical manifestations seeing here that can cause a vicious cycle leading to an aggravation of frailty syndrome. I just want to get just a little bit into it, starting at the upper right-hand corner. Aging, that's certainly something we all do. Disease is something we are facing eventually all, and medications, some of us or many of us might already be on those. However, all of these have an impact on muscular strength, on muscle mass, and sarcopenia. And once that process gets going, you can see how it affects a lot of different aspects of human performance. Metabolically, insulin sensitivity is reduced. Osteopenia and osteoporosis risks are going up. VO2 max, cardiorespiratory performance is going down. strength and power logically is declining, but also with a loss of muscle mass comes a loss of resting metabolic rate. Now, if you're looking at what happens when you're losing strength and power, all of a sudden balance becomes impaired. We're seeing more falls and injuries, immobilization, all the way to disability. Reduced cardiovascular capacities, reducing walking speed. Remember, one of the phenotypes, walking speed, is reduced. That also leads to overall decline of physical activity. Then again, that affects total energy expenditure, which leads to further chronic undernutrition. Something that we see in older adults quite frequently is not eating enough calories and not getting enough micronutrients. I will get back to this in a more simplistic way later on in the lecture when we're talking about nutritional strategies to prevent and reverse frailty. Good. Frailty, so far we have frailty defined by age-related biological decline. There is more to frailty syndrome. It is more than just the decline of your physiological reserves and functions. Frailty syndrome is more complex. We do see, besides the age-related biological changes, psychological and cognitive changes playing a role. They can play a role in the onset of frailty, but they also can be part of the exacerbation of frailty. As an example, increased levels of anxiety or depression can be the starting point in the decline of physical activity because of motivational levels dropping, but they can also be caused by the physical decline, by recognizing that I'm losing strength, I'm losing abilities, I cannot do the things that I really want to do any longer. I can't participate in activities of daily living the way I used to. That can obviously quite easily lead to depression and anxiety. Number three, also featuring into frailty, the frailty syndrome, are sociological changes. Sociological changes are another factor. Social isolation can be the result of either physical and or cognitive decline, which impacts one's ability to go out and meet. Sociological changes can lead, or social isolation can lead to depression and anxiety. Again, that has affecting motivation and affecting physical activity levels and so on and so forth. Social isolation is often caused by aging. If we're all getting old enough, then we're losing friends, we're losing family, partners. We might also lose privileges like driving a car, which is an important and big step. I mean, many of the people that I've seen over the years, that was quite a traumatic event when they were told that they were no longer permitted to drive. We do know today that in most cases, there is a reciprocal interaction between these parts of the complex, complex syndrome. We don't completely understand the causality and consequences yet, but we do see the interaction between those elements of frailty. Now let's move on and talk about strategies to prevent and reverse frailty. Before we do that, I'm going to ask and answer a question. The question is frailty inevitable? The answer to that is that ultimately, frailty can't be defeated. That means my headline of defeating frailty is misleading, or at least a bit too optimistic. There are age-related changes to our physiological systems, as well as cognition and brain function, that ultimately will advance, that we do not have a way yet to stop, and possibly never will. And with that, as long as we're all getting old enough, we will all face frailty. What we can successfully do, if not defeating it, is delaying the onset. We can even reverse frailty after onset, and that can be done quite successfully. As I mentioned in the previous slide, frailty is considered by experts today a multidimensional medical syndrome. To me, a syndrome that is that complex requires logically a multidisciplinary approach, a multidisciplinary strategy to delay the onset, reverse the existing frailty, and help our clients extend quality of life and independence for as long as possible and at the level possible at any given stage. Good. Let's take a look at such possible multidimensional or multidisciplinary strategies. What needs to be addressed and who is going to do the addressing? In other words, who do we want to be part of our team? And I encourage you to, if the team isn't existing in your community, to think about making these contacts. Create your own team, not only to be a better trainer, to be a better therapist for your clients or patients, but also because it gives you more work. If you are adding other people into your network, they will start referring clients as you referring clients back to them. So it's also from a business perspective, a move that I highly recommend. Now, who are these team members? Let's start. Number one, the strategy is physical activity and fitness training. Well, first of all, I mentioned this as number one because of the audience. I'm talking most likely to most of you being trainers, physical therapists, possible program directors. But it's also because it is by far the most researched form of intervention when it comes to reversing frailty syndrome or preventing frailty syndrome. That makes us, personal fitness trainers, physical therapists, and possibly occupational therapists, the frontline workers. It makes us the ones that are charged more with improving strength, stamina, balance, coordination than anyone else in the fight against frailty. Good. So we are already part of the team. Let's look at number two. Number two, dietary advice and nutritional supplementation. This was the second most common form of intervention I came across in my research for this presentation. The foundation or the dietary recommendation that I found just about everywhere, especially for the prevention of frailty, was the Mediterranean diet. It's named across the literature as the diet that seems to have the greatest success in preventing frailty. For those of you who are not quite familiar with the Mediterranean diet, it's based heavily on vegetables, fruits, nuts, beans, olive oil. It's built around plant-based foods. There are moderate amounts of dairy, poultry, eggs, and seafood. There is very little red meat in the Mediterranean diet. But beyond that, there are other recommendations that we see. For example, increase of protein intake in older adults. I mean, you guys are all familiar with these shakes that we've had, Boost and so on and so forth. And as of recently, I've noticed they are coming now in a higher protein dosage as well, based probably on these recommendations to have about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram and day of protein before you turn 75, and 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram and day after the age of 75. In addition, we have noticed that vitamin D deficiency has has a strong link to an increased risk of frailty. Therefore, suggestions go from anywhere, reach from anywhere from 800 IU to 2000 IU per day. An IU for vitamin D is 0.025 micrograms. Now, I don't make these recommendations to my clients and patients. I use a registered nutritionist, a dietitian, and or use a physician that is specializing in nutritional education and so on and so forth to give these informations to my clients and patients. That means registered nutritionists are part of my team to defeat frailty or to push back frailty. The next one, number 3, is medication and hormonal treatment. Now, very clearly, these interventions are requiring prescription privilege, which means we need on the team physicians. That can be the primary care physicians and or specialists. The more the merrier, if you ask me. But certainly primaries and even gerontologists are great team add-on to work on frailty. Number 4, cognitive training. This is often done by either medical brain specialists or psychologists. So I want psychologists on my team. And finally, psychosocial interventions. Still typically done through psychologists. If they do, they don't need to look any further, but it's also social workers involved with psychosocial interventions, as well as program directors, offering a variety of programs in their dwellings, in their residential settings that help overcome psychological and social problems. Good. Let's move on. Let's take a little closer look into the various strategies. Physical activity and exercise. We differentiate several different aspects of physical fitness. You all know that. This is nothing new. Strength, stamina, balance, coordination, mobility, flexibility, gait, and so on. I don't really want to get into too many details and specifics, but I do want to share a couple of tips that have been helpful in my work when working with pre-frail, frail, and dependent patients. First of all, aerobic cardiovascular training. I strongly recommend that as long as possible, you have your clients walk. If needed, with a cane, with a walker, with a caregiver by their side. As long as they can walk, this is the most common form of locomotion to move from point A to point B and should be part of training for that reason. However, some might get to the point where comorbidities prevent them from walking. May it be severe osteoarthritis, Parkinson's, severe neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy. If you can't walk with your client any longer, I strongly recommend you get into some equipment-based cardiovascular training. A lot of places that I go to that are assisted living dwellings offer, like the New Step, the seated stepping machine, arm and leg movement. Recumbent bikes are great because they're typically easy to get in and out of and provide a decent amount of safety and stability. Or in some places, I even have pools available, so I go and do some activities in the water, especially for my osteoarthritic clients. They love that. Good. Number 2, with respect to strength and resistance training, I think it's important to recognize that you do not have to reinvent the wheel or yourself just because you are working with this population. The training principles that you have been using with healthier and younger populations still apply in very much the same way to this population. There are some differences. One clearly is the speed of adaptation. That is much slower and will require for you to make, if you're making intensity changes, that those are happening in smaller incremental steps than you are used to from possibly a younger and healthier population. And the second difference is you need to be really do due diligence on becoming aware of all the comorbidities that are existing. They do typically play a slightly or significantly bigger role in this population than in those that are younger and or fitter. That said, my clients, they push, they pull, they squat, they lunge, they step, they deadlift in some form or another. I modify exercises to fit it to the client, but they still doing these types of exercises that we have done as young people and continue to do today. In my work, I'm going into the field. I'm working with most people, like I said, either in assisted living scenarios at home or assisted living dwellings. And I carry my equipment with me for the most part. So I'm using lightweight equipment, elastic resistance, the sleeves with, I like the tubing with the sleeves, injury prevention, and so on and so forth. I like loops, exercise loops, the bands that you can put around the knees and ankles. I use C-bands, but I also use household items commonly available to my clients. For example, a cane or a towel or a step from the garage into the house, stuff like that. What I also would recommend is that if you haven't done so already, to take a closer look at rapid movement training and cognified fitness training and make them part of your workout routines with your pre-frail and frail clients. Rapid movement training, what is it? Power training, rapid movement training. It's principally unloading to explode, right? Unload to explode, lighter forms of load, lighter forms of resistances, and increased speed of movement. That's what rapid movement or power training is about. Cognified fitness training is stimulating or challenging not just the physical aspects, but also the cognitive aspects as we're exercising. Now, giving you an example to each with the rapid movement training, with my population, I quite frequently use TheraBands, the yellow, the red, pulling, pushing at high speed. I use the Pilates balls, the little Pilates balls, 1-2 ounce balls to make rapid movement, whether it's diagonal chops or overhead presses, and so on and so forth. With cognified fitness training, let's give you an example. Clock lunges. Okay, I hope you guys are all familiar with clock lunges. You're standing in the center of the clock, you're facing 12 o'clock, and I typically just advise my clients, right side of the clock, right foot lunges, left side of the clock, left foot lunges, 12 and 6 o'clock you choose. And I start out by just going through the clock. Then I'm working on reaction speed and I'm going lunging 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock, increasing the speed so that they have bioacoustic signal respond quicker. In the next step, I do work on memory and I give them, let's say, 4 different times, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock. They have to do these 4 after I announce them in a row. Then I'm going to add the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. Now I want to intensify this a little bit more. I just have the person turn and face 2 o'clock and repeat these forms of exercise. So those are it's just a couple of examples for rapid movement training and cognified fitness training. I'm by far not the expert on that. There is people here at this event that are far greater experts at any of these forms of training, whether it's cognified fitness training or rapid movement training. And if you haven't tapped into that resource, I recommend you look them up and watch their presentations because they have some great stuff to offer. That said, rapid movement training is of a great benefit to this population and the benefits outweigh the risks, but it is not suitable for everybody. Again, that goes back to knowing the comorbidities. Number 3, balance training and coordination. So what I do with my clients, I do a lot of reactive core stability. I can do that seated, I can do that standing, pushing, pulling, eyes closed, various stances if they can still stand. I use agility ladders for agility drills. Of course, they look a lot different than, agility drills with other young athletes. I use hurdles hurdle stepping, sagittal plane stepping, frontal plane stepping, and I also do rotational stepping, improving or working on balance as well as hip mobility. I do single leg stands. We're doing step ups and step downs in order to be able to be outside and manage curbs and so on and so forth. And I work on gait if they are still walking with an attention to proper dorsiflexion and push off. Number 4, the final part, is mobility and flexibility training. So that, for me is part of my cool down stretching. I can do it seated with the non-ambulatory group, or standing, or even lying down. However, a large group of my clients isn't necessarily able to make it easily up and down from the floor. So I've, over the last few years, added a lightweight massage table to my equipment repertoire to take into clients' homes. And so they're exercising actually on a massage table, whether it's bridging exercises or at the end, stretching exercises, passive and active. Now, at this point, I would like to take a little detour, sidestep for just a moment, and I want to talk for a minute about working with cognitively impaired dementia patients, Alzheimer's disease, and other forms of dementia. From my perspective and experience, the biggest problem dealing with this particular population is motivation. If I can give one, and when you are working with this population, you will run into resistance. I mean, I've had many clients when I showed first up, they would either ignore me completely or make up something why they couldn't exercise. The biggest problem, the biggest mistake I think you can make at that point is to basically fight back and answer resistance with insistence. From my experience, it's far better to just deflect, start a conversation up about the activity they're just were involved with, talk about family, talk about the weather. In many cases, couple minutes of talk lets them forget about the initial no, the initial resistance, and then you can move into your exercise program. Works about 90% of the time. I also use for motivational tools music. I think even those with more advanced dementia love and enjoy music for the most part, as far as I know. And so I make it part of my research to find out what type of music they're enjoying. I had one client, she'd always be in bed when I come. She would ignore me for the first 2 or 3 minutes, and then I would kick off in the conversation. And if nothing else worked, I would get my phone out and play the Northwestern University fight song. That was her alma mater. She remembered the lyrics, she remembered the sound, and it got her going every time. So music is a great form of motivation, is a motivational tool for that particular group. Balloons. I like balloons working with this population because they're fun. They have a kind of the starting activity. They have this character of starting activities, but they're also moving slower than a ball. So that makes it, especially when they're moderate to more advanced forms of dementia kicking in, and reaction speeds are typically significantly slower, they can still deal with balloons while catching a ball is much more different. Good. One of the other things you don't want to do is ask whether they remember. They don't. They do not remember, and they just feel embarrassed often. So don't ever ask whether they remember. I go so far as not to use right leg, left leg, as a start with one leg, and then now we're working the opposite leg. That seems to work better because a lot of times when you say right or left, they get confused. I don't change my routine too often. And when I do, I don't make dramatic changes. And the reason for that is that this population finds comfort in recognition and repetition. If there's so little predictability for this population in day-to-day life that recognizing which exercise comes next is actually providing a sense of comfort. Good. Now, let's talk about the next strategy, dietary advice and nutritional supplementation. We already talked about this a little earlier. I told you I was going to come back to the cycle. And in this particular cycle, the authors have included interventions, dietary and nutritional interventions, and kind of where these interventions can possibly break the negative cycle or at least slow the speed with which your client progresses on such a downward spiral. There are meal replacements, protein shakes, what I call the Ben and Jerry diet, eat what you can and what you like, as much of it as possible. Amino acids, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, all of these are possible positive interventions on the side of nutrition and nutritional supplementation. Good. The next one we talked about was medication and hormone replacement therapy. This is where your physicians come in. Before I'm going to start to talk about the positive aspects of medication and hormone, let's take a little step back and look at the negative aspects of medication and hormone replacement. The population, pre-frail, frail, and dependent, is not only advanced in age, they also typically show a large number of comorbidities. That means in most cases, they are highly medicated. That's also referred to as polypharmacy. And this, I'm not going to call it over-medication because there's typically a good reason for each and every one of these medications, but this enormous amount of medication, this polypharmacy, does go along with risk factors or associated risk factors. There is, for example, orthostatic hypotension. So you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware of the different medications your patient is taking. And be aware that orthostatic hypotension, get up and go, for example, could be causing problems with lightheadedness, even fainting. Confusion doesn't always have to be pathological, doesn't always have to indicate cognitive impairment, can be just a side effect of medication and can lead to difficulties following instructions, exercise instructions. Sedation and fatigue is a very common one. If you have a heart problem, you have high blood pressure, you are depressed, you have trouble sleeping, all of those medications typically feature sedation and fatigue as a side effect. I had one client, I think I saw him at 11 or 11:30 in the morning. That gentleman had problems staying awake for more than 5 minutes because he was taking his medication right after breakfast, typically around 9 a.m. And so it was me calling his physicians and discussing possible rescheduling some of the medications that finally resolved that issue. Weakness, another side effect, common side, not so very common, but in one case I've seen it, reaction to statins that led to extreme weakness. But like I said, it's not a very common side effect of medication. Good. There isn't enough research done in this field so far. Most of what I've been reading were case studies, and the positive things were working around antidepressants and stimulant medications like Ritalin, for example, typically given to ADHD and ADD folks. But both antidepressants and Ritalin can positively affect the mood and motivation levels and improve participation in physical activities. There was another doctor or gerontologist in Utah who is utilizing hormone replacement, mostly with his frail male clients or patients. And this testosterone gel has shown great success, according to him, in this population, reducing sarcopenia and increasing appetite. Okay, like I said, I think there is a great potential in this strategy, medication hormone replacement therapy. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of research that I could find. That will hopefully change over the next couple of years. Cognitive training. I am certainly no expert on cognitive training and possibly lean too far out the window, but there are some encouraging studies out there that have shown that multi and single domain cognitive training is able to slow age-related cognitive declines in healthy older adults. And the keyword here is healthy older adults. There is not really any evidence that this cognitive training shows success in the prevention or the slowdown of Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately. The slide you're seeing here is a Chinese study, and that clearly in this study definitely produced positive outcomes for those involved in the study with respect to single and multi-domain cognitive training and short-term as well as long-term maintenance effects on cognitive abilities. So certainly should be in some way part of our strategies. Finally, psychosocial interventions. And I keep repeating myself, but it is important that we address physical and emotional and social aspects of frailty, as they often coexist and certainly influence each other. Social isolation in older adults often leads to depression, and with that associated motivational decline to participate in physical and/or social activities. For me personally, when I'm being asked by clients or clients' families on making a decision on whether to choose in-home care or a residential assisted living setting, I typically refer back to their social situation. If they are still socially tied in with neighbors, friends, family, they're most likely doing very well with in-home caregiving and staying in the setting that they have grown familiar with and are comfortable in. If they already have experienced social isolation because friends have passed away, family is not living close, or they have lost driving privileges, I more commonly suggest a community dwelling offering care to them, because there is the possibility of making new social contacts and interfering with the negative aspects of social isolation. Loneliness is associated with not only with a heightened risk for the development of frailty, it can also worsen frailty and prolong or make it harder to get out of frailty. Loneliness and frailty, as said before, are living in a reciprocal relationship. Interventions can be senior centers where people can go, whether it's for a coffee in the afternoon or for activities or to read the newspaper. Interacting with other seniors in senior centers is one way of getting intervening. Interest groups, a lot of people that are older, I have a lot of older clients, non-cognitive impairment, that are still playing bridge, for example, meeting once or twice a week. Video conferencing, what's been more important to seniors in these last 18 months or 16 months, whatever it was, than video conferencing. It was for many the only way to stay in touch with children, grandchildren, and other friends and family. Community dwellings, as I mentioned before, the broad variety of offers that you find in community dwellings can have a positive impact on psychosocial situations for your seniors. Good. Now that we have established that frailty is a multidisciplinary syndrome, and we have further defined the team, I would like to talk a little bit about the expansion of our team. I mentioned in the beginning our team being the physical fitness team, as taking care of physical fitness and physical abilities. Currently, this aspect of frailty syndrome is covered by physical therapists, by personal fitness trainers, occasionally occupational therapists, and well, who else should we add to our team, and why? Let's start with the why. This slide appropriately asks, are you prepared for the 2030 problem? What is the 2030 problem? US demographics, we expect that the 65 plus population in the US grows to 20%, that means every fifth American in 2030 is 65 or older. That will lead to a 40% increase in skilled nursing facility population for the 65 plus population. Why? Because the baby boomers are coming into the care age. Take a little more detailed look at this. This slide gives you a little more detailed insights into the changes of the aging US population. The two upper bars, the green and the light blue, together represent the population 75 plus, while the blue one at the very top, the light blue one at the very top, is the population 85 plus. If you're looking at 1980 through 2020, you see that those two segments have doubled in the past 40 years. And they are predicted to double again over the next 30 years. What does that mean in numbers? That means today we roughly have 52 million Americans aged 65 plus, and we do expect that number to grow to 95 million by 2060. The percentage of those 85 plus, the light blue at the top, will increase to 4.5% of total population by 2050. We can all imagine that this great increase in demand for care has some effects. One of them is it will increase the cost of care. And the cost of care to the care receiver today is already exceeding the financial resources of many. Further increases will likely result in more informal at-home care. Informal versus formal. Informal, a family member providing the care. Formal, a hired caregiver providing care. In 2018, the average cost for formal in-home care US-wide was between $17 and $22 per hour. Now, we all can agree that's not an enormous amount of money on the surface for a caregiver, which is a pretty difficult job. But if we're considering that the need for care might be 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and we're just taking 20 to make the math easy, we are looking at nearly $500 a day, and we are looking at roughly $180,000 per year. That's an incredible amount of money. Now, let's take a look at the cost of care to the care receiver for residential care. Now, I'm going to use, again, the 2018 statistic here. And it shows here adult daycare centers, $72 a day. That amounts to about $18,700 on the low end per year for adult daycare, 5 days per week, 52 weeks a year. And at the high end, at the very bottom, nursing home private room, you're looking at about $100,000 cost per day. Now, that is cheaper than in-home care, but keep in mind, in-home care is one-to-one, nursing home care is not. The cost here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live is often nearly twice as high. So it's an incredible amount of money spent on care. This high cost of residential and formal in-home care forces more and more older adults to reach and rely on family, also known as the informal caregivers, to provide the help they need. Though there is not a direct cost involved with that, there's indirectly a pretty high bill to pay for that as well. Now, let me just get into that very briefly. The financial impact on informal caregivers. Studies have shown that caregiver absenteeism, family caregiver absenteeism, costs the US economy an estimated $25.2 billion a year in lost productivity. Caregivers' productivity is reduced by 18.5%. That means the chances of making a career while providing care for a loved one and even staying in the job is definitely difficult. And finally, single female caring for their elderly parents are 2.5 times more likely than non-caregivers to live in poverty in old age. So clearly there is a price tag for informal care as well. Finally, let's talk a little bit about health risks. In addition to the high cost of care to care receivers and caregivers, all caregivers are also exposed to high risk of injury and illness. Injuries, shoulder, neck, back injuries, typically due to transfers, slips, and so on and so forth. Illness often due to exposure, whether it's bodily fluids, whether it's radiation in case of bladder cancer and implants, radioactive implants, and so on and so forth, makes the healthcare and social assistance industry the industry with the highest number of illness and injury, and especially the number of injuries by quite a large margin. Now, let's review this. Let me go through a brief review. So first of all, we see an enormous increase over the next 30 to 40 years in the population 65 plus that requires care due to the baby boomers coming into the care age. We are seeing a related increase in an already enormously high cost of care to care receivers and caregivers. I shouldn't even put informal caregiver, because if you are a formal caregiver working for yourself and you're getting sick and you're losing hours, obviously there is quite a financial impact there too. Finally, high risk for injury, illness, and emotional burnout for all caregivers, because it's giving, 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 correct? So how can we deal with these circumstances and still provide a program that is able to delay the onset of frailty or reverse frailty? You might have wondered why I gave you this data in my attempt to explain team expansion. The answer is cost and availability of a successful care continuum. In the very most cases, I realized that people hiring a PT or personal fitness trainer, in addition to the essential caregiver that they definitely need, has become increasingly cost prohibitive for a larger number of people. In addition, the growing number of those needing care is going to be increasingly difficult to provide care for, a care continuum for, even if the number of PTs and PFTs will increase. From my own experience, when I started working in PT in 1995, we had 2 types of patients, the twice per week and the 3 times per week patient. Today, my patients have a hard time getting into physical therapy once a week. That's already an indication of what lies ahead. So how can we reverse and prevent frailty despite those developments? The goal is to create stronger and healthier care receivers. Make sure our clients are as strong and healthy as possible for as long as possible, because that will equal healthier and wealthier caregivers. That's a little flippy, but it is true. The answer to our question and how we can get there: the caregiving exercise specialist. The caregiving exercise specialist, from my perspective, offers a quadruple win opportunity. The care receiver saves money by using personal trainers and personal fitness trainers and physical therapists less frequently. And you won't need to get used to changing caregivers all the time because of illness and injury. The formal caregiver improves his and her marketability, market value and marketability. Okay. Also, less loss of income due to less injury and sick days. Number 3, the care agency will ultimately start saving money on workers' compensation. Because of the high rate of injuries, workers' compensation rates for care agencies are enormously high. But if we're going to keep the care receiver healthy, we will keep the care providers healthy too. Finally, we as physical fitness trainers, we as physical therapists can share our expertise and continue care with a larger audience if we utilize the caregiving exercise specialist to administer our programs on a daily basis. So what is the caregiving exercise specialist? It's a new certification available through FAI. What does it try to do? It is trying to create a more competent and confident caregiver, whether formal or informal. Somebody who is better able to assist you, the personal fitness trainer or physical therapist, in administering the program that you have designed based on your assessment. You then, after assessment and the program design, you train both caregiver and care receiver together so that the caregiver is able to successfully administer your program on a day-to-day basis. I then drop back and I ask the caregiver to be in touch with me. I check in with them either in the beginning weekly, later on bi-weekly, to see if there are any questions or problems. And then finally, after about 2 or 3 months, I come back in, I reassess, and I retrain. I think in order to address the growing problem for care, we need to get the caregivers and make the caregivers part of our team to delay the onset of frailty and reverse frailty. Well, that was it. Thank you so much for joining me today. Happy to, if you haven't gotten the notes yet, I'm happy to share this with as PDF. You can send me an email at hartmut@backandform.com. Mention the summit, and I'll be happy to send you the PDF of this slideshow. Thank you so much.
Hartmut. That was a fantastic presentation, really digging into some of our more compromised clients and the steps we should take to ensure that we're getting this multidisciplinary team. I do have a couple of questions in here.
Okay.
One that we get often at FAI is just, how do you suggest that fitness professionals start connecting with and building a clinical team? Great recommendation from Carolyn, saying that her facility pre-pandemic would do monthly workshops for clients and patients and invite clinical partners to come in to get to know them. Do you have other recommendations that might be?
Case study on my own, I am working today with a group of physicians here in California. The whole mode of concierge physicians has become a pretty popular thing. Very briefly, you're reducing the number of patients, and you be able to provide care, better care, more detailed care for 40% of your previously existing patient base on a 365-day basis. And I'm sure everybody else you do a health intake form at the beginning of meeting a new client. Mine does include the names of physicians, primary care physicians, as well as specialists. And I'm actually still writing an old snail mail letter of introduction to these, because most of the time you can't get them by email. They don't give out the email address, or they have a gatekeeper that prevents you from getting it. Snail mail is the way to go. They're still getting that letter. They're reading it, has a business card in there. You introduce yourself as somebody who is working with the patient. You offer to keep in touch with the physician, update them on progress, and so on and so forth. I have also eventually then started giving introductions of services at these concierge physicians' offices. Often there's 3, 4, 5 physicians within an office. I tell, hey, if you guys have 30 minutes during lunchtime, I come in and tell you what we have to offer. So those are just a couple of tips on how we expand our field. But I think the one where everybody can start is sending out letters, introduce yourself to physicians. It's the first step. They often already know dietitians. They often know psychologists and so on, other people that fit into your team approach.
So they can help to connect to other people that may be.
Correct. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, that's very good. More questions can go into the chat if people have them. Let's see. So Linda says that she noticed the gap when working with a Parkinson's client. Caregivers needed to know what I was doing, and also the cook needed dietitian help. So basically that if a person thinks they can sort of be a one-off solution for all these different issues, it probably doesn't work really well for people who are pretty far down that functional aging hierarchy.
Correct. I think there's nothing wrong if you are the only sole provider of a very valuable service to this population. There's no reason to become depressed over it if there isn't a team approach in place. But certainly, from my perspective, there is so much to frailty that the more people we can get involved, the more experts we can get involved, the more successful we'll be in addressing the problem.
Right. Thank you for the definitions of frailty at the beginning too, to recognize it's not just somebody who's weak. There are a number of different characteristics that generally are part of a person who's frail, some of which aren't necessarily super observable, like what their energy intake is, right?
Correct.
For an hour a day, twice a week, and that's probably not when they're wolfing down food. So we really have no idea what their energy intake looks like. More questions for Hartmut? And feel free to unmute yourselves, folks, as well, if you would like to ask a question. Hartmut, is your clinic's name or your company's name Back Inform?
Yes, it is. Yes. And you can find us on the web under that www.backinform.com. If you have questions that come up later, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm typically pretty good at responding within 48 hours or so.
Worst case, we'll send you a snail mail.
That's right. That's right. Still old school.
Yes. Linda.
Hi. I came into this a little bit late. I apologize. But I just wanted to know what drove you into this kind of work, Hartmut?
Accident. Not an accident, really. Accidentally, I got into it. I actually started studying in Cologne at the German Sports University with the intention to become a sports journalist, and then was through friends in college exposed to the work with disabled people, young people at that point, and decided, okay, to switch gears and become an expert on rehab in orthopedics and internal medicine rather than working as a journalist. And then, like I said at the very, you missed that in the very beginning, I said I started working for the city of Cologne as a student already with their adaptive physical ed outreach program for seniors throughout their senior center system in the city. And what I found and still love about working with this population, and I'm getting closer and closer in age to my population that I'm working with, is the stories. People that have lived a while have a lot bigger storybook than those who haven't, and I have always enjoyed that as a bonus part of working with this population, and still do.
Which fits with your journalist thinking.
Correct. It does.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
We've got another 3-4 minutes. If anybody else has a question they'd like to unmute and Hartmut. All right, Hartmut, was the first summit that you've presented at?
This was the very first time. I mean, I've done presentations throughout my years working, but mostly for the ones that I'm trying to convince of my services. So this is my start to lecturing to fellow trainers and therapists. So it was a new experience, and certainly I'd rather would have done it face to face. Hopefully we can do that pretty soon. But this has to do for now, and it works pretty well, I think.
You're off to a great start, Hartmut. We would be excited to have you present at future summits as well. Let's see, Judy, we'll make this our last question/comment. Long-term care homes in Canada seem committed to enable frailty and dependency. Too few staff in general, outdated attitudes and outdated expectations of aging, declining prevail among everybody. There is minimal budget for space for physical activity. Walkers and wheelchairs are encouraged for fall prevention. So, I mean, really, there's a lot of work to do, and I think she makes a very good point there.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
she is now here unmuted, so you two can have a little conversation about this.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, part of that is the lack of education. I mean, if you're looking at nurses or caregivers, they have not been educated in the form we have as trainers and or physical therapists. So that is one of the gaps that we need to close. They need to better understand the benefits of exercise. They need to understand what are the changes. What they do know typically are the health, the increase for health risks, but what are the changes to aging? How can they better assist their clients?
I want to intervene and say that is true. My bigger challenge that I find is just in the overall system. It's not there yet. There's not enough
Correct.
staff. There's not enough help.
Correct.
So
And
I do this, but I find it in COVID not at all. But
Yeah.
it's rather exhausted because you listen to a lot of people who are frightened. I think I might have just cut myself off.
no,
You're
Oh, my
still
screen.
with us.
Oh, sorry.
no, you're still there.
Okay.
So I think you're right. I think the problem of the system, there are obviously a few. I mean, cost of care. Can you hear me?
I can. I just can't see
Okay.
myself, but I'll keep talking.
Okay.
It's all good.
So the cost of care is a big factor. I mean, you said the too little staff, especially when it comes to dwellings, community dwellings, and that is mostly a cost factor. The community dwelling living is already pretty expensive for the care receiver. If you provide more staff, the cost goes further up. So that's definitely a big issue. And that was the second one that I was thinking of, and I can't remember what I was going to say. But I do believe that the more we get involved, I mean, I'm working with people in the settings, but I really work on my own with them. Okay. And I often, if I am in a setting, I meet with the activity director. One of the activity directors just recently approached me and said, what's new? So there is a willingness to learn. It's up to us to close the gap. Oh yeah. The other problem that we're seeing is and that's why the encouragement of walkers all over the place is litigation. There is so much litigation ongoing in this country. I don't know whether it's the same. What did you say? You were from Canada?
Well, I'm from Canada.
Yeah.
Here we have a public healthcare system, but there's also for-profit retirement homes. And they're so similar and so different, but I almost see there's a sense to encourage frailty. So for fall prevention reasons, for example, like
Correct.
what's going on here? This is just like enough already.
Yeah. And I've had arguments even with physicians that are referring patients to me that have put people on a walker that, from my perspective, were put on a walker way too early. Okay. There's always a good reason for safety and so on, whether it's a cane or walker, but you don't have to exacerbate or accelerate the decline by bringing these aids in at a time when they're not needed yet.
Yeah, and often these aids are brought in without any training how to use them or the proper adjustment.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's a funny one. I just went to a client's home for the first time, and she didn't even know that she could adjust the height. Nobody had told her that she could adjust the height of the handles. So her husband was bent over because he was a pretty tall guy. Yeah, education, and that's where FAI comes in, right?
Yeah, and that's I've been really applauding all that they do. But I did have one comment about
I'm very sorry to cut you off.
Oh, okay, I'll be quiet.
We're already 3 minutes over time.
Okay.
Carolyn asks you specifically, Hartmut, about the caregiver exercise specialist training program you were discussing. Is that specifically for somebody to have better expertise when working with frail adults, or is it meant to train caregivers how to better assist?
So the caregiving exercise specialist is not supposed to replace the personal fitness trainer or the physical therapist. It is just an educational lecture recognizing that they don't have a educational background in anatomy, human physiology, and so on and so forth. But make them more confident and competent when they are assisting you as a trainer or a physical therapist. So what I would like to see is that people talk to the caregivers that they're working with today and let them know that it is available through FAI, and that they will get some insights into the changes that come with aging, the health changes that come with aging, some basic introduction to training, how to manipulate training intensities, and so on and so forth. Just broaden their knowledge about the topic of exercising with this population.
Gotcha. That sounds like a fantastic resource. Okay, we are almost 5 minutes over time. Hartmut, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming in and presenting. We look forward to having you at future FAI meetings.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.